All right, gang, welcome back to chapter 5. We're going to be looking now at the second book of the Bible, which is the book of Exodus. And in there, of course, we find one of the great figures of the church as well, and the great figures throughout the entire Old Testament and the Scriptures. We find there the story of Moses. And so we want to dive into a little bit about that. What I want to do is I want to break Moses' life down, at least his story in the Bible, into 9 segments that we will then reference throughout. And it's really fascinating. You might think, well, okay, if like, for example, Moses being rescued by Pharaoh's daughter, right? You all have learned about that when you were in vacation Bible school and you had your classes and your mom and dad read the books or whatever, the Bible books, children's stories, right? All these things you have heard before, and I want to make sure that we understand that, maybe start to see a little bit of a deeper element to why what's going on there, and how they then play out and have an impact on the events that follow, even into Christ, and how Christ in a lot of ways is prefigured in these stories. Okay, so when people would have heard and seen Christ's story from a distance, they would have started to recognize, you know what, that was just like what happened to Moses. And that was just like what happened to Abraham and Isaac and Joseph and all these, and so on and so forth. So I want to break these down again and make sure that we know these 9 elements of Moses' life and his story in the book of Exodus, so that when we come back to them at various points throughout the year, we'll be able to say, remember that thing that happened in Moses' life when he did that. That also plays an important role here. Okay, so the first one is fairly straightforward, not a whole lot to say about it. But Moses, when he was born, they at the time were putting to death the male members of the Israelites. The Egyptians were putting them to death, right? They were worried that they were going to start spreading and rise up and actually become more prevalent than the masters, the taskmasters, the Egyptians who were holding them in slavery, right? So we see this in our own day as well, with people trying to control populations and trying to keep people from having children, or killing their own children, killing other people's children. Everybody's always worried about what's going to happen, about the poor, or there's going to be too many people coming up. And so, again, Moses' mother, though, in the midst of these boys, the Israelite boys being all killed, Moses' mother puts Moses in this basket, floats him down the river. Pharaoh's daughter rescues him, and so Moses is brought into the Pharaoh's family, the king or the president's family, right? So here the irony that an Israelite boy who was supposed to be put to death is actually brought into the house, the kingdom, and the family of the guy who ordered putting everybody to death, putting all those boys to death. And so again, Moses is brought into the royal family of Pharaoh. Now, Moses eventually murders someone, kills someone, and flees Egypt, even though he was a member of the royal house, right, and was close family members. So Moses then, the next important stage there of Moses' life, that again has a lot of important imagery and a lot of important things to say about things that will happen later, is the burning bush. Moses is walking around, and he's actually established a family, and is in this wilderness area, and he comes across on the mountain this bush that's burning, that does not consume the bush. There's just a fire. And from the bush there comes the voice, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." So the bush, the flaming bush, introduces itself. It says, and Moses falls down, takes his shoes off. He realizes he's on holy ground, right? But look at that phrase from last class. How does God introduce himself? I am the God of who? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? We talked about those 3 guys, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as being the 4 generations, part of the 4 family generations that had this huge impact on the Old Testament, right? So here again, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. We hear them. Abraham, originally the father of the faith, he has the son Isaac, who then has his son Jacob, who is renamed Israel. And then Jacob has 12 sons. One of them is Joseph. The brothers all sell Joseph into slavery. Joseph ends up saving the whole family because there's a famine, right? So that's how God introduces himself. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we'll hear that throughout the Old Testament. Number 3, of course, is a story that you're all very familiar with. I didn't even go find a picture of it because it's from, a lot of those the Prince of Egypt and those kinds of movies, right? Let my people go. Moses eventually returns to Egypt and goes to Pharaoh and says, on behalf of God, I've been sent here by God to tell you, you need to let the Israelites go forth from their slavery, right? Now, of course, as we know, the fourth event is hugely important. It's the Passover. And what is Jesus eating the night before he dies with his apostles and his disciples? He's eating the Passover meal, right? So this Passover is huge for us as Christians, right? So when we think about the Passover, that is, of course, what happens here is that Pharaoh eventually says, no, I'm not going to let my people go. I'm not going to let your Israelites go. And so Moses then tells all the Israelites, he says, God is going to come tonight. He's going to send his angel tonight. You need to mark the door of your post, the wooden posts of your door, with the blood of a lamb. So they went out and they sprinkled blood all around their door, the wood of their doors, right? And then inside, they had their Passover meal. They ate the sacrificed lamb, and they were ready to flee with their clothes on, ready to travel the next morning, right? And so what do we have going on here? So, of course, the angel passes over these homes where there is blood on the door. Now, what's amazing about this is Jesus is referred to as the Lamb. He is the person who does not put up resistance. He allows himself to be sacrificed. And so that is, Jesus is in a way the Lamb. So we see the Passover, the disciples and apostles and the next generation of Christians, the first generation of Christians would have said, you know what? Everything that Jesus did in his life, including his death, was very similar to and beautifully related back to the Passover. So here we have the wood with the blood on it, right? Well, where else do we have blood and wood mixed together in order to save people and allow the angel of death to pass over? Well, the cross. Right? The cross is wood, and it has the blood of Christ sprinkled on it. Christ being the Lamb again, right? So, just as this happened in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, for us, we, through the blood that has been sprinkled on the doorpost of the cross, the angel of the death passes over us, and we are able to inherit eternal life too. Just as this lamb, as this lamb was sacrificed, so Christ, we eat Christ, the Passover lamb, right? We literally eat Christ. And so in that same way, so all these things that happen with this story of the Passover are hugely important for us, not only back then, but also now today, because so much of it is describing what we do in our life as well. Number 5, the parting of the Red Sea. So the Israelites leave after they leave after the Passover meal the next day. But then, of course, as we know, Pharaoh decides he wants to chase them back down again. And so they get to the Red Sea, and Moses parts the Red Sea. The Israelites pass through the Red Sea, and they come out on the other side, and the Egyptians are destroyed in that water as it folds back in. Okay? This is not just a great story from back then, and not just a true thing, which it is. This happens, right, of course. But when the Israelites pass through the water, we refer to that as this is a prefiguring, a foreshadowing of what happens in baptism, right? We too walk through the water, right? We come through the water and we come out on the other side. And what happens is in the wake of that, as we pass through the water of baptism, death is destroyed behind us, just as the Egyptians were destroyed, right? So again, this really happened, of course, but then also now we see the deeper meaning and another meaning of what that was a foreshadowing of as well, being the sacrament of baptism. Okay? Number 6, of course, the 10 Commandments. Moses comes down and gives us the 10 Commandments, but he finds the people making a golden calf, so Moses destroys the 10 Commandments in his anger. He smashes them, goes back up, and God gives him a new set of the 10 Commandments. God sets this new covenant with the people, and so on and so forth, right? So a lot of times that's why you'll see the lightning bolt and the people in fear, because they knew that they were misbehaving down at the bottom in the camp while Moses was up on Mount Sinai, right? So we have this hugely important event, all right, where we talk about the 10 Commandments. This is the first time where God is telling his people, this is how you should live. If you live this way, according to these laws, these will lead you to your freedom. Right? All the other gods and all the other kingdoms and so forth, Pharaoh's gods and the Egyptian gods, we're not giving them laws and rules about how to be happy and how to structure their life and what things to avoid. Right? So this is considered to be a great gift that God gives us these commandments to orient our life. But again, as we've said before, we are tempted very often to view them as burdens, and so we want to reject them and do our own thing. Right? Number 7, after they, as part of basically, but let's just say after they receive the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, we have, of course, them wandering in the desert for 40 years, right? And they're sent to do that because of their complaining. They're not following and they're not trusting in God. God tells them, you will now wander before I bring you to the promised land of Jerusalem, and so on and so forth here in Galilee. Before I bring you there, you will and your people will wander the desert for 40 years. And so there's this traditional route. There's different scholars disagree on exactly what routes they took. But the point is that they wandered for a long time. You know, down here in the Sinai Peninsula, down here is Mount Sinai. Okay, up here is the Sea of Galilee, or the Dead Sea there. So they had all of this. They were wandering through the desert, and they were a people that was on the go. That's the important thing, really, to keep in mind and to remind ourselves about. The 8th thing, God institutes the priesthood. So as they're wandering around, okay, something very important happens. God not only gives them these commandments, He begins to prepare and make way for this creation of His presence in the midst of them. Okay, now He needs 2 things in order for this to happen. He first of all needs a priesthood. And so what happens is, it says in the Catechism, all the people, the Israelite people, were God's chosen people. And they were all charged with being a kingdom of priests and being a holy nation. So all people are asked to offer sacrifice, to give of themselves, to, in a sense, live out their priesthood, right? But within the people of Israel, God chose one of the 12 tribes, that of Levi, and set it apart for liturgical service. So God creates let's go back to this one slide here where we look at the brothers. There are the 12 tribes of Israel. They're all living in Egypt, and these are the guys, their families, that they all leave together, right? When it's time to leave, they leave through the Dead Sea and following Moses. Now, one of these tribes, the tribe of the brothers, everybody that's living under the tribe of Levi, God says, I am making them my priests, and they will serve as my priests in a liturgical way, basically in a thing that is a prefiguring of the Mass. Okay, now, so not only do you need priests, though, you need something for the priest to do. You need the sacrifice, you need the ritual that the priests are supposed to follow. So God gives them that as well. God instructs the Israelites on the tent and the tabernacle and worship. Okay, God literally spends throughout a big chunk of the book of Exodus telling His people, giving them very specific instructions on what type and color of curtains to put on the outside of this tent. This is all one big tent, right? And inside there we have the Ark of the Covenant. And then we have an altar here, and we have some candles here, and we have bread that's set out to be consecrated here, right? This is exactly how Catholic churches are set up, right? This whole tent was called the tabernacle, and that is the meaning of basically a place where God is dwelling or pitching His tent. And so, if we think of the Catholic Church, you come in through the back, right? There are candles, there's an altar, and then behind the curtain and back in there within the inner sanctuary it's the Ark of the Covenant, but now it's not the Ark of the Covenant, it's Jesus Himself, right? Jesus literally dwells in our Catholic churches now. But this again, God lays this out and says, I want you to build this. And then they broke this tent down anytime they had to move. They broke it all down. And then when they would get there, they would set it back up again. Now here's the priests. So the priests then, the Levites, were the ones who were asked to go in and basically offer sacrifices in the tabernacle or in the inner sanctuary there. Okay? So just like that, that's exactly what a priest does now. A priest is a person who's been set aside to go in and lead liturgical worship. Doesn't make this person special in the sense that it means necessarily that guy's going to be any holier than you or any holier than I. But he's been set aside for this service and this work to do this as on behalf of all of us. So we have the priests, and then God gives them the blueprints for the church, basically, that they're going to carry around with them as they travel from place to place. Okay? So that's the tabernacle. Now, where else do we hear the word tabernacle? Of course, as I was saying, our church today has a tabernacle in it. That's exactly what we call the golden box there that's in the center of our altars at both of our parishes. Again, not just priests that have access now, okay? So it used to be that priests could only come in here and they could only go back in here once a year, and only priests could offer sacrifices and so forth, right? Now, we all have access to the church and to the tabernacle all the time. We can always be in there. So as long as the church is unlocked, we can go in and pray there, right? You can come by any time of the day. Now, Mary is also considered a tabernacle. All right, we talk about Mary sometimes as one of the first, the original tabernacle, kind of in a sense. Okay, now in our church at Annunciation, we have the stained glass windows behind the altar. And one of the stained glass windows has the word tabernaculum in it, which is tabernacle, right? It's Latin for tabernacle. So what we have here going on is a larger set of phrasings, which is ecce virgo et pariet tabernaculum and sanctificavit suum. Okay, so we have those on both sides. Basically, they're describing Mary, sanctificavit suum tabernaculum. He made holy his tabernacle. So he made holy Christ. When he is conceived in the womb of Mary, he makes her holy from the inside out, right? And he turns Mary then into a tabernacle, because Mary literally, just like the tent and just like the tabernacle in our churches, Mary carries the Christ child inside her body. And so because she's doing that, she is made into a tabernacle, right? Very similar to, but even more special than the tent, because the tent was just carrying around, in a sense, the presence of God, but Christ is God in a unique way. And so Mary is the first one privileged to carry Christ inside her, and that idea that she becomes a tabernacle because she's bearing Christ. Now the good news is that you and I also, when we receive communion, when we receive Christ, we become tabernacles too. We are literally, Christ is not dwelling in the womb, but He is dwelling literally in our stomachs, in our digestive system, in our bodies. So in the very same way that Mary carries Christ around in her womb, we carry Christ around in our bodies as well when we receive communion, right? So that should really blow our minds. I mean, we should be thanking God for that all the time and just really amazed that we too are allowed to become tabernacles, just like the original tent was, just like Mary was during her pregnancy, and also we are when we receive communion, okay? The questions for today, the things that I would like you to do for your homework, I would like you to list the 9 important events of the Exodus story that we have talked about and numbered in this lesson. What are the 9 events that I pulled out there and kind of I even numbered them for you, right? So just if you could maybe describe them, give the titles of them, because again, we're going to keep coming back and referencing them as we go on throughout the year, because so many of these things that in Moses' life in the book of Exodus will come back up again. Those stories will kind of, in a sense, repeat themselves or replay themselves in other people's lives, and whether it's Christ or some of the other saintly people in the Bible. So what are, again, the 9 important events of the Exodus story that we have talked about and numbered? That's all we have today for class. I hope that everything's going well for you. And if you need anything, or if I can pray for you in any way, please don't hesitate to let me know. God bless you guys.